Ever feel like college is just one massive info dump? Like you're constantly getting bombarded with readings and lectures, and it's just too much to handle.
Yeah, I get that. And it's not even just about, absorbing it all in the moment. It's about making sure it actually sticks, making sure that knowledge becomes something you can actually use later on.
Totally. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to explore how to become a super learner, not just for acing those college exams, but for building skills that'll last a lifetime. Think of it like a guide to your brain, how it learns best.
That's it. Our goal is to help you unlock your brain's natural learning power. And we're going to do that by tapping into this awesome book, The New Science of Learning, How to Learn in Harmony with Your Brain, by Terry Doyle and Todd Zakharczyk. It's packed with insights.
This isn't about those same old study tips or some pep talk about having the right attitude. We're going deeper. We're looking at the actual science of what's happening in your brain as you learn.
Exactly. The authors really want to empower you. They want you to understand the learning process so you can learn smarter, not harder. Work with your brain, not against it.
So let's get into it. The book starts off with something pretty mind-blowing. What actually happens inside your head physically when you learn something for the first time?
It's kind of crazy when you think about it. New learning isn't just some abstract mental thing. It causes physical changes in your brain structure. Picture your brain as this massive network, right? 86 billion brain cells, all connected. And when you learn, certain brain cells actually start forming new connections.
Wait, so you're saying every time I learn something new, my brain is literally rewiring
I
itself?
got it. Those new connections create networks. And those networks represent what you've learned. It's like a physical trace of your new knowledge.
I remember reading about something called long-term potentiation. How does that fit into all of this?
Long-term potentiation, or LTP, is basically the strengthening of those connections we just talked about. Every time you practice something new, those connections get more solid, more efficient. So think about each time you review your notes. You're not just refreshing your memory, you're literally making those pathways in your brain stronger and faster.
Wow, so reviewing is actually a lot more powerful than I thought.
It is. And for this new learning to really stick, to become long-term memory, you need consistent practice. You can't just hear something once and expect it to be there forever. You got to engage with it, connect it to what you already know.
It's like building with Legos. You can't just slap a new piece on randomly. You got to connect it to the structure that's already there.
Exactly. That brings us to the idea of distributed practice. You got to space out your practice over time. Think of it like training for a marathon. You wouldn't try to run the whole distance the day before the race.
Right? That's like the classic cram session before an exam. You might remember enough to pass, but it's not going to stick with you for the long haul.
Nope. The authors are very clear about this. Cramming isn't true learning. You're not building those deep, lasting connections. And you're probably not going to be able to use that information in different situations, which is what we call transference. True learning means you can take what you've learned and apply it in new ways.
So, memorizing facts for a test isn't the same as really understanding a concept.
Right. Your brain thrives on making connections. It wants to link new information to stuff it already knows. Those connections make the new knowledge more meaningful and easier to remember.
And the book has this really powerful principle that I think every student needs to hear.
Yeah, it basically boils down to this. The one who does the work does the learning. There's no way around it. You have to be actively involved. You got to practice, read, write, think, discuss. That's how you forge those neural connections.
So, learning physically changes our brain. We got to put in the effort and we got to be consistent. The book also talks about some things we often neglect when we're busy studying.
Yeah, things that are absolutely crucial. Sleep and exercise. They're not just good for your body, they're essential for how your brain learns and remembers. Yeah. The authors dedicate entire chapters to these topics, which shows how important they are.
Okay, let's start with sleep. I mean, we all know how groggy we feel after a bad night's sleep, but how does sleep actually affect our ability to learn?
The science is super clear on this. Not getting enough sleep seriously messes with your learning. Adults need like 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep each night, and teenagers, they need even more, like 9 to 10 hours.
Wow, 9 to 10 hours for teenagers. I bet a lot of them aren't getting nearly enough.
Probably not. And unfortunately, a lot of adults aren't getting enough sleep either. And for college students who are already juggling so much, it's even harder. Studies show that a huge percentage of college students report feeling sleepy during the day and not getting enough sleep. And that's been linked to lower grades. It affects concentration, memory, all of it. The really important memory stuff happens in the second half of your sleep, so if you cut those hours short, You're kind of throwing away your study efforts.
So those all-nighters to cram might be doing more harm than good.
Totally. Think of it this way. During the day, as you're learning, your brain stores information in a place called the hippocampus.
Hmm.
But the hippocampus is like a temporary holding area. It's got limited space. Sleep helps transfer those memories to the prefrontal cortex, where they can be stored long term. It's like clearing out your computer's RAM so it can run smoothly.
Makes sense. So what happens if we don't give our brains enough time to do this nightly transfer?
Well, it's like trying to cram more stuff into an already full suitcase. Sleep is essential for a brain that's ready to learn. And a lot of that crucial memory consolidation happens in the second half of the night, so consistently cutting your sleep short can really sabotage your efforts.
What about the different types of sleep? Like when we dream, does that affect learning too?
Yeah, REM sleep, the stage where we dream the most, is also thought to be important for processing emotions and solidifying certain types of memories. All stages of sleep are important, but REM has its own unique role.
The book talks about how some people are naturally morning people and others are night owls. Does that change anything?
It definitely acknowledges those individual differences. But whether you're a morning person or a night owl, the best measure of whether you're getting enough sleep is simply how rested you feel. If you're constantly tired, that's a clear sign you need more sleep.
So for those of us who are night owls but have early morning classes, is there anything we can do?
There are things you can try, like avoiding all-nighters and scheduling your most demanding study tasks for when you tend to be most alert. And of course, make good choices about what you eat and drink before bed. Caffeine and alcohol close to bedtime can mess with your sleep. Creating a consistent bedtime routine is important too. And yeah, limiting screen time before bed is a big one because of the blue light. Getting some sunlight during the day can also help regulate your sleep cycle.
What about naps? Are those good or bad for learning?
Naps can be helpful, but timing and length are key. Short power naps, like 20 minutes, can boost your alertness and focus. Longer naps, around 90 minutes, can also be beneficial, but you got to make sure you go through a full sleep cycle. Naps that fall in between can actually make you feel more groggy. Ideally, a nap taken about 8 hours after you wake up can be really helpful for attention and decision-making.
So a well-timed nap could be a good study strategy.
It could be. The book also makes a point about back-to-back classes. It might not be the best way for your brain to learn because it doesn't give you any downtime to process and consolidate information from one class before jumping into the next.
It makes sense. Like your brain probably needs a little break, a chance to breathe.
Exactly. And here's something really interesting. Research suggests that during sleep, your brain actually prioritizes strengthening memories it thinks will be important in the future,
Ah,
especially if you know you're going to be tested on them. So your intention to remember actually matters. But here's the thing. Sacrificing sleep to squeeze in more study time is actually counterproductive.
so those late nights cramming might actually be backfiring.
Yep. The book lists all the usual suspects for poor sleep among students, like late night studying, socializing, screen time, and it offers tons of practical tips for improving your sleep habits. Things like setting a consistent sleep schedule, keeping track of your sleep, watching your diet, limiting caffeine and alcohol, creating a relaxing bedtime routine, making sure your bedroom is cool, dark, and quiet. And it even talks about how important good sleep is for athletes. They actually need even more sleep to recover and perform at their best.
Okay, we've covered a lot about sleep. Now let's talk about exercise. How does moving our bodies help us learn?
John Rady, a psychiatrist at Harvard, wrote this book called Spark, and he makes a really strong case for exercise's impact on learning. When you exercise, your brain releases all these chemicals and proteins that actually help it take in, process, and remember information. It's like exercise gives your brain a boost of learning fuel.
So it's not just about physical health, it's about brain power too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rady's main point is that exercise is the single most important thing you can do to improve your learning. And there's a ton of research to back it up. Prolonged sitting, on the other hand, is increasingly being recognized as harmful, not just for our bodies, but for our cognitive functions too.
What exactly is happening in our brains during exercise that makes this possible?
Well, any movement is better than none, but regular aerobic exercise, the kind that gets your heart rate up, is especially good. It increases your body's need for oxygen, which strengthens your heart and improves blood flow throughout your body, including your brain.
And that brings all the essential nutrients and oxygen to the brain, right?
Read it. Back in 1995, a researcher named Carl Kottman discovered this protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And this stuff is basically like fertilizer for your brain cells. It keeps them healthy, helps them grow, and even encourages the formation of new neurons. BDNF basically makes your brain more receptive to learning.
Wow, so exercise can actually help our brains grow and make new connections.
It can. And it's not just BDNF. Exercise also increases levels of key neurochemicals like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. These chemicals are involved in alertness, attention, motivation, positive mood, patience, and self-control. All those things are crucial for learning. So exercise basically releases brain chemicals that make you more alert, focused, and motivated to learn.
It sounds like exercise prepares our brains for learning in so many ways.
It really does. And there's evidence that it even has a positive impact on behavior in schools that have incorporated more physical activity.
That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and exercise also stimulates neurogenesis. That's the growth of new brain cells. And it specifically happens in the hippocampus, which is that area of the brain that's super important for memory. As we get older, the rate of neurogenesis slows down, but exercise has been shown to keep those brain functions active.
So, the million-dollar question. How much exercise do we need? What kind is best? And when should we exercise in relation to studying?
Well, trying to do intense mental work during vigorous aerobic exercise might not be the best idea because blood flow actually gets directed away from the prefrontal cortex, which is like your brain's learning center. But the period after exercise is a prime time for learning because blood flow returns to the prefrontal cortex.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Definitely. Studies show that even just 30 minutes of aerobic activity a few times a week can improve executive brain function, which is like your brain's control center. The authors suggest aiming for 30 minutes of moderate exercise most days of the week, with at least one rest day.
What about learning new physical skills while we're getting that aerobic exercise?
That can be really beneficial. Learning complex movements, like dance or martial arts, while your body is active, can create even more neural connections throughout your brain. What's interesting is that your brain can sometimes repurpose these new connections for other cognitive areas. Like learning a musical instrument can actually have a positive impact on learning math.
That's fascinating how skills in one area can influence others.
It is. The book even suggests some practical ways to incorporate more movement into your daily life, like using a balance ball instead of a chair. It engages your core and can improve focus. Or even using mini exercise bikes under your desk while you study. Treadmill desks and standing desks are also options. Anything to reduce prolonged sitting and encourage movement.
So getting enough sleep and exercising regularly are must-dos for anyone who wants to learn effectively.
Absolutely. They're not just optional extras. They're foundational to how your brain works and learns best.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how we actually take in information. I used to think that some people were just naturally visual learners or auditory learners. Is that really how it works?
The whole idea of distinct learning styles based on our senses has actually been challenged by neuroscience. What we know now is that our senses work together. Engaging multiple senses at the same time can significantly enhance learning and memory.
So it's more about using a combination of our senses, not just relying on one dominant sense.
Exactly. Researchers believe that our brains evolved to thrive in environments where we're constantly taking in information through multiple senses. So learning that relies on just one sense, like just listening to a lecture without any visuals or interaction, might not be the most effective way to learn.
Yeah, when I think about the times I've really learned something well, it usually involves seeing it, hearing it, maybe even doing something with it.
Right. Even before we had the sophisticated brain imaging we have today, studies were showing the benefits of multisensory learning. One study found that students who both saw and heard information remembered way more of it 2 weeks later compared to those who only saw it or only heard it. Each sense gives you a different way to access that information later on.
There's a really interesting example in the book about a class that used multiple senses to teach about nutrition.
Oh yeah, the I Should Have Studied Smarter 100 class. They use this hands-on multisensory approach to teach about the sugar and fat content of foods. Students could actually see the amounts, feel the weight of the sugar, even taste a little bit. And students consistently said that this multisensory experience was the most memorable part of the class.
That sounds like a great way to make abstract information more concrete and easier to remember.
It is. Research shows that we only remember a tiny bit of what we read or hear, but we remember a lot more when we both see and hear it. Engaging multiple senses leads to better and longer-lasting recall. It can even boost creativity and problem solving.
And it's not just about sight and sound, right? What about smell, touch, taste?
They all play a role, although more research is definitely needed. Smell, for example, has a very strong connection to memory. And vision, as the book emphasizes, is super powerful because such a huge part of our brain is devoted to processing visual information. They even suggest that everyone is a visual learner to some extent. But combining these senses is really where the magic happens. Studies have shown that when you learn using both auditory and visual input, you learn more in less time.
The book also mentions visual tools like concept maps. How do those fit into this whole multisensory learning thing?
Concept maps are visual representations that can help you understand information better. They show the relationships between ideas, and because our visual system is so powerful, creating these maps can make learning and remembering easier, especially for complex topics. Seeing those connections laid out can make a big difference.
It's like creating a visual architecture for information in our minds.
Exactly. They show the hierarchy of ideas, with main concepts at the top and supporting details branching out. And you can see connections between different areas of information. They're really versatile tools for brainstorming, outlining, understanding readings, even preparing presentations.
It sounds like a way to make abstract relationships more concrete.
Exactly. And the book also talks about elaboration, which is basically creating multiple paths to access information in your memory. Using more of your senses is a key way to do that. The more ways you engage with the information, see it, hear it, say it, write it, the more likely you are to remember it.
So the more senses we involve in learning, the better.
Pretty much. Learning and recalling information become much easier when you take a multisensory approach. Try not to rely on just one way of taking in information. The book even points out that athletes naturally use a multisensory approach in their training, which might explain why they tend to learn best that way. So bring that same approach to your academic studies.
Okay, so our brains are multisensory learners. What else does the book tell us about how our brains organize and make sense of new information?
Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. They're constantly trying to connect new information to what we already know by looking for similarities and differences.
Like when you're learning a new language and you start to notice words that look or sound similar to words you already know.
Exactly. That pattern recognition makes it easier to learn and remember those new words. The book gives this example of trying to memorize a random string of numbers versus memorizing a phone number. The phone number is easier because it has a familiar pattern, which gives it meaning and structure.
That makes sense. A random string of numbers is just noise, but a phone number has a format we recognize.
Right, and think about this sequence. 3A1 U5I9 E70. Seems hard to memorize, right?
Yeah.
But I tell you, it's odd numbers followed by vowels. It suddenly becomes a lot easier to recall because you've identified a pattern.
Oh, that's a good one. It shows how a simple pattern can make seemingly random information much more manageable.
And the power of patterns is really evident in complex fields like chess. A beginner who only knows the rules will struggle to plan ahead because they're using all their brain power just to figure out basic moves. But expert chess players are able to recognize patterns of potential moves. They've got these patterns stored in their memory, which makes them much better at the game.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, the structure, not just individual pieces of information.
Exactly. Thinking involves creating those links and refining patterns. Sometimes we even perceive patterns where none actually exists, just to create a sense of order and predictability.
The book gives an example about categorizing food words.
Yeah, a list of random food words is harder to remember than the same words organized into categories like breakfast foods or dinner foods. Those meaningful categories provide a pattern that makes recall much more efficient.
And there's this idea of chunking information. How does that work?
Chunking is basically about organizing information into meaningful units. Think about trying to remember a random sequence of letters versus trying to remember the words cat, dog, and run. The words are easier to remember because they're familiar and meaningful chunks. Even a sentence is easier to remember than a string of random words because it forms a bigger, coherent chunk.
So chunking is like packaging information in a way that our brains can handle more easily.
Exactly. Learning isn't just about effort. It's also about finding the patterns and meaning in the information so you can create those mental chunks. Recognizing patterns allows you to create chunks, and chunking makes it easier for your brain to handle the information.
The book also talks about these Gestalt principles, which are about how we perceive patterns visually.
Yeah, these principles describe how our brains naturally organize visual information. One is similarity. Our brains tend to group things that look alike. For example, if you see a list of words in different colors, you'll likely group them by color in your mind. Teachers often use this by highlighting important terms in the same color. Recognizing those similarities can help with recall.
What about figure ground?
That refers to our brain's ability to separate an object, the figure, from its background, the ground. When you're studying, it's important to identify the most important information, the figure, and not get lost in less critical details.
And proximity.
Proximity is the idea that we tend to see things that are close together in space or time as being related. The book has an illustration showing how simply putting things close to each other can create a connection in our minds.
So all these principles are about how our brains naturally try to make sense of information, to find order and meaning.
Exactly. The book even points out that textbooks have a consistent structure. You've got headings, subheadings, main ideas usually at the beginning of paragraphs, followed by details and examples. Recognizing that pattern can help you navigate through dense material more easily and pick out the key information. It's not about treating every sentence in a textbook as equally important.
That's a good tip for tackling those long reading assignments.
And the book even connects the idea of recognizing patterns to success in sports. They talk about Wayne Gretzky's ability to anticipate where the puck will be. He was so good at reading the game, recognizing those patterns of movement. Lots of great athletes in various sports have this ability to anticipate based on subtle cues and patterns.
So whether we're talking about academic material or a sports game, the ability to spot patterns is a key to understanding and excelling.
Definitely. It's about training your brain to see the underlying structure and connections.
Okay, we've covered how learning changes our brains, the importance of sleep and exercise, how to use our senses, and the power of patterns. Now, what about repetition? Does simply repeating information help us remember it?
While interest and relevance definitely make a difference, the book emphasizes that repetition alone can lead to learning. We call this overlearning. Think about how you might learn the lyrics to a song you hear a lot, even if you're not trying to memorize them.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true. I can still remember jingles from commercials I haven't seen in years.
Exactly. A psychologist named Herman Ebbinghaus did some early research on this, and he found that repeated exposure to information reduces forgetting. And that principle still holds true today. If there's something you really need to remember, overlearning is a good strategy. Every time your brain encounters new information, your memory of it gets a little bit stronger. And every time you actively try to recall that information, you make that memory even stronger and easier to access.
So just being exposed to information multiple times and actively trying to remember it helps make it stick.
Exactly. The book talks about this as your learning behavior. How you engage with new information really affects how well you'll remember it later. The more you elaborate on the information, the stronger the memory. This means thinking about it in detail, using your senses, maybe even connecting it to your emotions.
What about the importance of getting it right the first time?
That's huge. The neural pathways your brain uses to process new information for the first time are the same ones it uses to store it. So paying attention in class when you first encounter the material is super important for forming strong memories. The quality of that initial learning experience really matters.
The book shares a personal story about learning Spanish, but then forgetting most of it. What happened there?
The author took 2 years of Spanish, did well in the classes, even lived in a Spanish-speaking country for a while, but now only remembers a few basic phrases. The reason: cramming for exams instead of consistent review and practice. If you want long-term retention, cramming just doesn't cut it.
So consistent review over time is crucial for making learning last.
Absolutely. Daily review, even for short periods, is a great form of distributed practice. It helps your brain build stronger, more accessible pathways to that information. Remember, memory has two parts: the information itself and the cue that helps you retrieve it. Review strengthens both.
And it's not enough to just passively reread our notes, right?
Right. The book recommends active recall. Try to remember the information without looking at your notes. Saying it out loud, writing it down from memory, or explaining it to someone else is much more effective than just rereading. Every time you successfully recall a memory, you strengthen it and make it easier to access in the future.
The book also mentions how our existing knowledge and our interest in a topic can affect how well we remember things.
Yes, the more you already know about a subject, the easier it is to learn and remember new related information. Your existing knowledge provides a framework, and interest is huge. If you're genuinely interested in a topic, you're much more likely to pay attention, engage with the material, and remember it. Trying to learn something you hate is a recipe for disaster.
So finding a way to connect to the material, even if it seems boring at first, can make a difference in how well we learn it.
Totally. The book gives several tips for elaborating on information. which helps solidify it in memory. Things like making flashcards, creating concept maps, summarizing the information in your own words, discussing it with classmates, using your senses, connecting it to your own experiences, even creating songs or mnemonic devices. All those things create more pathways for your brain to access the information.
What about emotions? I know I tend to remember things that were emotionally charged much more vividly.
That's a powerful factor. The amygdala, the part of your brain that processes emotions, actually boosts memory formation when it detects a strong emotional response. Events with emotional significance are often important for our survival, so our brains are wired to remember them. Try to connect new information to personal memories or find the emotional relevance in the material.
Finally, the book addresses why we sometimes forget things.
Yeah, it talks about three main reasons. Blocking, where the information is there but we can't access it, often due to anxiety. Misattribution, where we remember something but attribute it to the wrong source. And transience, which is the natural fading of memories over time. Transience is particularly relevant for learning. We can lose a lot of newly learned information quickly if we don't work to retain it through overlearning and regular retrieval.
So memory is not just about getting information in, it's also about maintaining and being able to retrieve it.
Exactly. The book connects this to athletics. Mastering basic skills through consistent practice makes those skills automatic, which frees up mental resources to focus on more complex aspects of the game. Overlearning allows athletes to perform those actions without having to think about them, which is super important under pressure.
Okay, let's move on to something more internal. Our mindset. How does our mindset affect our ability to learn?
Mindset is basically how you view your own intelligence and abilities. It has a huge impact on how willing you are to tackle challenging learning tasks and how much effort you're willing to put in. Carol Dweck, a psychologist, has identified two main types of mindsets: fixed and growth.
So what's the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset when it comes to learning?
A fixed mindset is the belief that your intelligence and abilities are pretty much set in stone. You're either good at something or you're not. A growth mindset, on the other hand, is the belief that your abilities can be developed through hard work and dedication.
I can see how those two mindsets would lead to very different approaches to learning.
Definitely. People with a fixed mindset tend to avoid challenges, see obstacles as proof of their limitations, view effort as a bad thing, it means they're not naturally talented, take criticism personally, and feel threatened by other people's success. They think that if you're truly smart, things should come easily.
That doesn't sound very conducive to learning. What about those with a growth mindset?
People with a growth mindset embrace challenges. They persist even when things get tough. They see effort as the path to mastery, they learn from criticism, and they find inspiration in other people's success. They believe that they can improve through learning and hard work.
So it's about seeing learning as a journey of continuous improvement, not something you either have or you don't.
Exactly. The book has examples of people who achieved amazing things through dedication and practice, even if they weren't considered naturally gifted. It emphasizes that every time you practice something, your brain gets better at it.
And mindset is crucial in athletics too, right?
Oh, yeah. Successful athletes learn from their mistakes, they see feedback from their coaches as valuable, and they believe they can always improve. They practice relentlessly until those skills become second nature. That's a combination of overlearning and a growth mindset. Your mindset can really make or break your athletic development. A growth mindset helps athletes focus on strategy, put in the effort, and learn from setbacks.
It sounds like having a growth mindset is about resilience and believing in your ability to learn and grow.
Exactly. It's about seeing challenges as opportunities for growth, not as threats to your ego.
Okay, the last big topic in the book is attention. That seems pretty obvious, but it's absolutely crucial for learning. What are some key takeaways?
The book lays down the law. Attention is non-negotiable for learning. You can't learn anything if you're not paying attention. Boredom is a major obstacle, even when the material seems simple. And on the flip side, when material is really challenging, our minds tend to wander.
I know that feeling all too well. My mind drifts off during lectures or when I'm trying to read something difficult.
And we've all been there. The book talks about the idea that sometimes true learning requires us to push through that boredom and actively engage with the material. It argues that things aren't inherently boring. It's all about complexity in our prior experiences. Sometimes you have to actively look for the challenging or interesting aspects of something that seems dull.
And sometimes having bigger goals in mind can help us stay focused.
Absolutely. Having those long-term goals, like graduating or achieving a certain career, can give you the motivation to keep going, even when the task at hand isn't very exciting. And sometimes the problem is a lack of prior knowledge. That can make something seem boring. So you might have to put in some extra effort at first to build up enough knowledge for the topic to become interesting.
What about daydreaming? Is that always a bad thing?
Daydreaming is a normal brain activity. It's tough to stay focused all the time, but if your attention is drifting too often, it will definitely affect your learning. Successful students tend to have strategies for minimizing distractions and improving their concentration.
Now, what about multitasking? We live in a world that demands it.
The book makes a distinction between true multitasking, which is doing two complex things at the same time, which is practically impossible for most people, and task switching, which is rapidly shifting your attention between tasks. That constant switching actually makes us less efficient and can hinder learning. Even listening to music with lyrics while studying can be distracting unless the music is super familiar or you're actively trying to block it out. Focused attention on one task at a time is usually the best way to learn.
So, trying to juggle multiple things at once isn't the best strategy for learning.
Nope. And the book reminds us that getting enough sleep is crucial for attention. A tired brain can't focus. The hippocampus, that temporary storage area, needs rest to be ready for new information. And regular exercise helps a lot too. It releases those chemicals that improve attention.
Any practical tips for improving our attention?
The book suggests writing yourself reminders, creating a dedicated study space without distractions, recording lectures so you can revisit anything you missed, keeping your long-term goals in mind to stay motivated, and breaking down big tasks into smaller chunks so you don't get overwhelmed.
And attention is just as important in sports, isn't it?
Definitely. Keeping your head in the game is essential for any athlete. Top athletes can focus despite distractions, both external and internal. They train themselves to control their attention, using different types of concentration depending on the situation. They might even have specific cues or triggers to help them stay present. And by practicing routines until they become automatic, they free up mental space to focus on the more complex aspects of the game, especially when the pressure's on.
So, improving our attention is a skill that can benefit us everywhere, not just in school.
Absolutely. It's a skill you can develop, and it's essential for learning and performance in all areas of life.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. It's amazing how much we know about how our brains learn.
It really is. And the authors point out that students today have a huge advantage. Thanks to advances in brain imaging, we have a much